Moving right along to the 10th President of the United States, John Tyler. Again, let's go over the 5 criteria before we get started. First criteria is growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and to leave the country better or worse. So starting with growth, before we even get into the 5 criteria, let's give a little background. Tyler was not elected president. He was the vice president of William Henry Harrison, who had died after about a month in office. He was, when he became president, it wasn't even clear that he was going to be serving out the term. There was a lot of debate and discussion as to whether the vice president was just supposed to be a placeholder until an election could be held, or if the vice president, because they were on the ticket with the president, was supposed to fill out the rest of the term. Tyler was on the ticket with the famous slogan, Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. They decided the vice president does serve out the term because he's on the ticket. This went back and forth, and Congress may have regretted that. In terms of growth, Tyler was very much a minimalist in terms of government. He didn't believe in a lot of the things the Whigs believed in. He ran on the Whig Party ticket mainly because he hated Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian politics. His political philosophy, as far as aligning with the Whigs, had nothing to do with what many of the mainstream Whig politicians at the time believed. He opposed the national banks. He opposed infrastructure spending. And so when the Whig Congress came in very excited because they had won the election and they had, swept out all of the Jacksonian Democrats and had a majority in Congress, when Harrison dies, suddenly they have a person who really is in opposition to everything they say, who vetoes banking bills, who vetoes infrastructure projects, who's driving them absolutely crazy. His cabinet disliked him. I think the entire cabinet, except for one person, resigned in protest because of his vetoes. He did everything he could to minimize financial plans that the Whigs had. So when we're looking at terms of growth, there are a couple things I can give him slight credit for. He did, but it was more in solidifying things that existed rather than creating anything new. So I wouldn't say that he actually. So, and we'll get to this with regards to like Texas. He was in favor of the annexation, but the annexation didn't happen on his watch, partially because he was incredibly unpopular. With regards to the Oregon Territory and Maine, he negotiated treaties, but the treaties were really not able to be fully implemented, and there was some argument, at least with regards to Maine, he didn't get as much territory as he could have. I think the Oregon negotiation, it ended up being right around what he negotiated. So I don't want to give him no credit for that. I think when we talk about Polk later, as I was looking at this, I'm kind of, again, when we're looking at left better than found, in some ways he did, in terms of foreign policy, set some foundations that Polk could build on. He also had what they call the Tyler Doctrine with regards to Hawaii, similar to the Monroe Doctrine, making a claim on Hawaii that would come into play later. So you can make some arguments with regards to growth, physical growth of the country. He did some things that laid foundations. He did restabilize relations with Great Britain, which we'll get to in international politics. But he also did nothing to stop the continuing. Again, we have the Panic of 1837 still going and went on all throughout his presidency. He did little to help any type of recovery in the country that had started, under Van Buren. Again, I argue caused in large part because of the Jacksonian politics. He did little to make that change, and he just constantly fought with Congress, didn't get much done, didn't accomplish much in terms of growth, so I'm not going to give him a very good regard there. With regards to finances, same thing, if not worse. Again, he inherited a bad economy. He inherited bad policies that had crashed the economy. Like my argument would be Jacksonian policies gave a sugar rush during Jacksonian times that became a huge crash with the Panic of 1837 that they were still recovering from. Now we're going almost 8 years later at the end of Tyler's term, and was still had a country that was in this long of a recession, basically, arguably a depression, caused by these horrible policies, and he did nothing to correct it. He fought tooth and nail constantly to have any changes in policies that would have improved it because he didn't believe in government spending. He didn't believe in infrastructure projects. He did not work to fix the problems, and he was loathed by. Like he wouldn't run for. There was no point in running for the election. He wasn't going to win. His own party despised him, and the other party wasn't much a bigger fan. He couldn't get. They didn't impeach him, but he wasn't a dishonest person. He was just bad at his job. In addition, he also picked, and this is where I'm going to get into growth and kind of get into the war and security, international politics. Again, going back to international politics, he was fine. I think he did a good job of de-escalating the conflict with Great Britain. Um, the treaty negotiations seemed okay. I think he did a fair job. When you read about people who are trying to praise him, they'll usually point to international politics. I don't think he was exceptional. I think he was fine. And I also think he left a lot of things undone that Polk had to resolve. Um, and we'll discuss that when Polk comes in. And if you want to give him credit because he kind of pushed us in a direction, I guess in theory you could give him credit. I particularly don't, because I think the way he left them was quite messy and left Polk in a situation where he was going to have a war with Mexico. Left Polk in a situation where he was going to have that 48-50 fight argument with Great Britain. I don't think he resolved anything. I think he just kind of stirred up a little bit on the pot that Polk had to come in and clean up. That leaves us with war and security. He did not do he left the we were on the edge of a war with Mexico because of his Texas annexation stuff, and his picking of John Calhoun as Secretary of State. I keep saying this. John Calhoun is one of the great villains of American history. He stirred up the fight with regards to it being a slave state entry. All of the things that would eventually become the American Civil War were exacerbated and antagonized during his term, and he did little to de-escalate that. Left us on the brink of a war. The Fremont expedition. I have a specific dislike of the Fremont expedition because I had to do it. I was doing a deep dive on something else and just reading how just Fremont just going around the country killing Native Americans wantonly, just basically antagonizing the Spanish, just doing all of these things, kind of stirring out the pot for war that would come with the Mexican-American War. If you want to argue, and when we get to Polk, I will kind of make this argument that the Mexican-American War, because of the outcome, was to America's benefit. I could see that. But I also think we could have just negotiated that land. I think that land was able to be taken without the war. I think Polk very nearly did. And I think it was probably something that could have been done under Tyler, and he just failed to do it. So I'm not going to be able to give Tyler credit for what came later that Polk did, because he didn't do it on his term, and he kind of put it in a situation where it was going to have to be a war because you had to proceed because he had stirred the hornet's nest so much. Given all of that, when we're having the better or worse discussion, which I think is the most important conversation you have about any of these people, I think he left the country worse than he found it. I think John Tyler basically was the first president that when he left office had diminished the presidency to the point that people just kind of looked at it with disregard in some ways. He was in some ways an embarrassment. They were willing to put papers of impeachment. They blocked his. He was the first president who could not get his cabinet officials put forth. He couldn't get a Supreme Court nominee put through. He looked weak and incompetent throughout his presidency. He failed to accomplish his goals, and he left the country as bad, if not worse, than he found it in most regards. I'm going to put him at 10th as the worst president so far. He will. I don't think he'll end up being the worst president overall, but I think his presidency was an utter failure. I'm even putting him below William Henry Harrison, because at least Harrison during his 1 month, the only thing Harrison did that I can say is a significant flaw is picking John Tyler to be his vice president. John Tyler basically left the country on the brink of war, still in the same financial distressful situation that they had, did little to expand infrastructure. The only things I can give him credit for are some of the negotiations he had with Great Britain with regards to the Oregon Territory and Maine, but even that was left in a dangerous position when Polk took office, and I don't want to give Tyler credit for what Polk was able to pull off. So again, that's where he's going to fall.